Hey, everybody, welcome back to your Dawn of Autonomy podcast. I'm Dawn Zoldi, your host and the CEO of P3 Tech Consulting, as well as the publisher at Autonomy Global. If you haven't signed up for our newsletter, please do that. You're going to love the articles we're pushing out every day. But here we are on our podcast, and we've been doing this thing for 5 years in various iterations with a different monthly theme every month. And this month is dedicated to safety and standards. And boy, who better than to talk about that than Charlton Evans from End State Solutions? This guy helps people get certifications. He's been navigating these waters, if you will, for many years on the crewed and now uncrewed side. So really excited to have him. And by the way, shout out to Viasat, our monthly sponsor. Super appreciative of everything they're doing to keep our skies safe as well. But so welcome, Charlton. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks. Very
I
glad to
see.
be here, Don.
Yeah, well, look, I've seen this guy in action many places at National Business Aviation Association, where he's on the Emerging Technologies subcommittee and involved in my Law Tech Connect workshop. By the way, another shameless plug, sign up for that at Exponential. Registrations are pouring in. We only have 175 seats. Love to max it again this year. So check that out. But Charlton, for those that don't know you, can you give them a little bit of background about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I was a Marine. I flew Harriers in the Marine Corps, and then got out of the Marine Corps and joined in situ here in the Columbia River Gorge, where we were building and flying UAS, the Scan Eagle specifically for DoD at the time. And along that route, I ended up flying, I ended up heading up the commercial division at In Situ with a fellow named Paul McDuffie. So at the time, it was two of us trying to conquer the world and enter the commercial sector with UAS. And eventually jumped from In Situ and started my own business, which is End State Solutions. So we've been doing this now for a little over 6 years and been quite successful.
So when you were at In Situ, is that how you know John Damish from who's now, was Irish, I think
Absolutely.
from In Situ, and then now with U Avionics? Is that how far you guys go back?
Yes, yeah, I actually worked directly for John for quite a while when he was there, and we still keep in touch through the MBAA Emerging Tech Committee, where John co-chairs that. So, yeah, the gang's still together.
Yeah, I knew you guys had that connection, and now I've just connected the dots. That's awesome, awesome. All right, so you created End State Solutions. Why? Like, what was the problem you guys were trying to solve in creating this business?
Well, I had formed great relationships with the folks at the FAA, and some of them were either getting ready to retire or do other things. So we saw the opportunity to help companies navigate this very complex and challenging world of certification. At the time, it was really focused on type certificates and production certificates for UAS. And we did some of that, certainly. It's expanded into other modes of certification and approvals. But basically, it's to get companies into revenue service. And we do that through, and it's on the deck, but we synthesize action with deliverables or artifacts that create the volume that you need to go get certified or go get an approval from the FAA to actually get this work done. So there are many modes of that, but primarily you've got to get from product that's basically like a prototype into a configuration that's locked down that the FAA will approve so that you can go do commercial work with it. And that's one of the tenets of civil aviation.
You may not know this, Charlton. Probably nobody else knows. I've been working with a company for some content in connection with NASA and advanced air mobility. And one of the things I was just working on was this certification block, or AAM law and policy, if you will. I don't know that there are so many people in this industry, but they may not fully appreciate that the cert process, the FAA certification, it's all about safety.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the whole point. So can you explain the difference between type certification, which you mentioned was kind of what you cut your teeth on, if you will, in the beginning of the company, and production certification, so TC and PC?
Yeah, absolutely. So the TC is the design. So when the engineers dig in, they want to see the configuration. They want to understand everything about it, soup to nuts, right? So this allows us to kind of peel back the layers on the product and understand the components of it, how it's designed, what its function is, and how it performs its function. The production certificate is how that product is made. So you've got the design and you've got how it's created, how it's manufactured and maintained. So those two go hand in hand. And in most cases, in a type certificate context, you get the type certificate and you get the production certificate in order to produce that type.
Right. Now, what about airworthiness certificates? That basically is that, well, what it sounds like, that your design is worthy to be in the air in the case of an aircraft. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, and an airworthiness certificate is just a broader term over top. So a type certificate is an airworthiness certificate. You can get experimental airworthiness certificates. You can get exemptions in lieu of type certificate that create an airworthiness approval. So airworthiness is like you say, it's just the basis by which the FAA says yes, that is not going to fall out of the sky. It has been certified or approved to a certain standard. And we'll go over some of those different standards along the way.
Okay, cool, cool. Yeah, because I mean, in the UAS world, for 55 pounds and under, for the most part, right? Part 107 essentially said you don't need an airworthiness certificate
Right.
to fly commercially because we gave you this rule, Part 107. It's the bigger aircraft are the things that kind of fall outside of those parameters where you're looking at that, right?
And
So,
that's
and
that
you,
you hit on it. That weight level, that weight limit of 55 pounds is basically there because everything under 55 pounds has been deemed low risk, right?
yeah,
You can only do so much damage. It doesn't mean there's no risk,
yeah.
but there's no reason to actually go through the type certification process under the 107 rules because it's not enough risk to warrant it.
Yeah. Now, Charlton, you kind of alluded to this, but I want to dive a little deeper. You said, in the beginning of your company, really it was kind of the type cert, the production cert. How has the company evolved over time?
Yeah, well, the FAA has evolved, so we
Yeah.
kept pace with that. So the 44807 exemption process. Uh,
Explain to people what that is because they may not know.
yeah, so it's in the continuum. You mentioned Part 107, and we
Yep.
mentioned type cert. So the 44807 process is an exemption process that's in between the two. And flight standards effectively applies the durability and reliability criteria for certification through an operational lens. So they take all the things you got to do for what's called a DNR type cert, and they take that over and say you declare, applicant or petitioner, that you've got all these artifacts and you've done all this testing. We'll check that out. We'll give it a quality check, and we're going to accept it rather than deep dive the design. You say you've got a design, you say you tested it like this, you accept the liability for operating it under this exemption, you get an exemption for airworthiness. So now you've got that airworthiness chunk or that part of the equation, and then you have to go operate it either under the 107 operational rules, 91 rules, or 135, depending on what you're trying to do with the equipment.
And 135 is those air carrier operations. So when you think about drone delivery, that's kind of what we're talking about there. So Charlton, the Congress gave the FAA that authority to basically enable beyond visual line of sight operations before we have a final rule on that. I mean, is that what they're leveraging, this kind of interim or intermediate thing between 107 and type cert, this 44807?
Yeah, and all of these, the 44807, an experimental airworthiness certification or a type cert, is all a way of measuring or ensuring reliability. And
Right.
so for reliability, it's really about ground risk, right? We
Mm,
don't want this thing performing or functioning in a way we don't anticipate, or failing to function and falling out of the sky. So
yeah.
that's the piece that really, this is going to make it reliable enough to perform its intended function and not create a hazard to people on the ground. The
Yeah.
operational side, we mentioned 135 and air carriers, there's 137, 136, all these different rule sets that apply to the operation. That's to keep us from bumping into each other in the air, right?
Right.
So when the FAA invokes the waiver process, or you've got to apply for a waiver, it means you come to the table with an airworthy product, and
Yeah.
now you want to go operate it in the airspace, and you may need a waiver because there's not a pilot in the cockpit. For example, for see and avoid is the most common one. So some kind of detect and avoid mitigation. Every rule, be it airworthiness rules or operational rules, exists to mitigate a hazard. And in
Yes.
general, the airworthiness rules are there to mitigate ground risk through reliability. And the operational rules are there to mitigate all the other risks that are created by going and flying in the airspace.
Yeah, Charlton, you put together a great slide called the why and the how. We'll go ahead and pop that up. But we've kind of been dancing around it, but I like how you very directly said this is why it matters. So walk us through why all of this is important. I mean, we are in safety and standards month. Why is this so critical?
So outside of Part 107, you can't get there from here without a certificate or an approval of some kind to do commercial work. And I think every company knows this at some level, but many companies fail to take into account the level of effort that goes into it early on. And if it's planned for it, if it's very intentionally approached, then it's not such a big hurdle. But there are many companies that have probably not taken into account the level of effort that has to go into a certification, be it a type certification or 44807. But you just can't go operate without it. It's the basis by which the FAA says, yes, this is safe.
And when
So
you say operate without it, you're really talking about more complex operations. I mean, we'll go ahead and take this slide down. But I remember on your earlier slide, you had some of your success stories, and we'll get into that a little bit further. But things like Matternet, I think, was on there. Uh, yeah, yeah. I mean that was huge, right? Everybody's like, "Oh, look, they got this first type cert." And if my memory serves, this is just kind of way back machine a little bit. But that was like you guys were behind that, like you were helping with that.
yeah,
And just to
we
foot stomp this, like how so to give people, you know, an appreciation for how complex this can be, how long it might take. Can you give us just based again without like a specific client because that might be weird. But let's just on average, if you're pursuing a type cert, how long are you seeing this in the drone space? Like we'll talk about eVTOLs in a sec,
yeah.
but just for drones, like what's that kind of average timeline?
So the targeted date, and this is a shared target by both FAA and industry, for a type certificate under the that highest level is about 3 years, and that's kind of a minimum. That's where
Yeah.
everybody wants to get it done. The FAA attempted to take the process and squish it down and right size it for these lower risk products.
Yeah.
And that's what Matternet and Percepto got their type certificates under. It was called the durability and reliability process. It was the same rules. It was just a different way of interpreting them that was supposed to address the lower risk nature of what they did. And
Okay.
it really didn't pan out that way. It took both companies a long time to get through. I say it took the companies a long time. It took the FAA, the companies, everyone together way too long. It should have really been about a 6-month process, but it was in excess of 4 years from Matternet.
Holy shnikes. What they were front runners. Sometimes it's the people that are doing it first that pave the way for those that come behind, right? So I've actually heard companies say, "Hey, we don't want to be the first.
Right.
We'll just kind of ride that, the coattails of the
Right.
people that
But what came out of that
yeah,
was the FAA observed among the lessons were learned that
yeah,
this was not a viable process for a company trying to get into service with a low risk product. And that's when the shift happened from the engineering or air side of the house over to flight standards, where flight standards took the very same process but applied it through an operational lens. And that's what we have through the 44807 process today.
and how long are those taking?
They should plan for a year. It's
Hmm.
conceivable you could get done in less, but it's still a process that's got to go through the Federal Register. So there are sort of built-in delays, if you will, delays from the industry perspective, process from the FAA perspective, where you've got to go to the Federal Register, get comment, And that allows the public to say, okay, this is what the FAA and this company are proposing for airworthiness. Are we good with it? The public comments, the FAA addresses the comments. That just takes time, and then the exemptions are granted.
Okay, so those, what was it, last year, Charlton, or the year before, there were 4 that came out in the Federal Register almost like around the same time. I'm gonna say it was like around this
Yeah.
time. It was like April or May,
Yes,
and those were all published almost like, simultaneously, like, "Hey," and then the idea was, and please correct me if I'm wrong. The idea was, from the FAA standpoint, if you are essentially flight following the template that's in the Federal Register for X company. In other words, you're
yeah,
doing the exact same thing and it's already been commented upon and already approved.
yes.
That should expedite that person's approval. Do they still have to go in the Federal Register even with their stuff? If they're
They
following, like, say, Phoenix Air Unmanned's
they
exemption?
do they do. However, if you truly are um, petitioning in a way that's that similar, you can petition for something that's called a summary grant, which
Ah,
invokes this concept that this is the same. We see what they're doing. We're doing the same thing. We're providing you with equivalent data, right? You still have to produce the manuals and the test results and all the things that are behind that
yep.
exemption. But yes, you can shorten the process somewhat. And what it does is it reduces the number of review cycles within the FAA.
Yeah.
That tightens the timeline.
Oh, that would, I would imagine, significantly, and so now everybody, you understand why you need a guy like Charlton to handhold you in your specific case to make this happen. But by the way, everybody, of course, we are live, and just wanted to acknowledge some folks out there in the chat. We got a couple super fans, Mark Ganong from the Nevada test site. So Mark is here with us almost every week. So really appreciate Mark and everything he's doing out there. He'll be, by the way, at Law Tech Connect on the State of the States panel, talking about what they're doing out in Nevada. And Greg Larson is saying, "Good morning from Augusta." So, Greg, great morning to you as well. So, thank you guys so much, and keep it coming. Let us know where you're from, and have any questions for Charlton, because like this is the guy whose brain you want to pick on this topic of safety, certification, standards. Speaking of standards, I think we have a great slide also that you put together, Charlton. I know you titled it "Oversimplified," which is hilarious. But we've kind of been talking about this, the product, the operational rules, specifically if you're some kind of an air carrier, what other operations. Tell us a little bit about this, and as you're doing it, maybe hit some of the best practices and approaches you've seen along the way.
Sure. As the slide tries to illustrate, right, you got a product, a design, you lock that down, you go through the design review or design assessment process to get certified or approved. And then you go operate it under an operational rule set, as we talked about before. And in many cases in the drone world, that does fall under Part 135 for air carrier work, 136, 137, ag, etc. There are even proposed systems out there over 12,500 pounds that would operate under Part 121 air carriage. That's a little bit down the road for sure, but there's no reason it can't be accomplished. And I say that because when we get on the airliners we fly today, they are highly automated already, right? It's not that big of a leap to pull the pilot out of the cockpit from a technical perspective. Not going to happen tomorrow, but it's coming someday. Maybe you and I will have that opportunity. Best
Well,
practice, go ahead.
yeah, go ahead. Please continue on.
Best practice really is to engage early and understand that to de-risk getting through this process, you've got to have a plan early on that addresses how you're going to get through that first part. How are you going to certify or get approved your design so that you can enter into the operational world? And most, or maybe not most, but many companies certainly say, yep, we understand, we got to get certified, but let's talk about what we're going to do in the market and get our investors really excited about what this thing goes and does. Well, to de-risk it for the investors, everybody's got to understand how you're going to get over this first hurdle of actually certifying or approving the design through the FAA. I think oftentimes that doesn't get enough weight in the early strategy and early planning process.
Well, you raise a good point. I mean, I know people do engineering feasibility studies even when they just have a novel concept, but, can I even get this thing off the ground? The fly is one thing. The next thing, of course, then is can I actually get this thing certified and what does that look like? And, all those rule sets that we were just looking at, Charlton, those equally apply to other emerging aviation aircraft like electric vertical takeoff and landing or
Yes,
eVTOLs or what we call
yes,
air taxis,
yes.
in common parlance. Um,
Or even
Short,
conventional takeoff
yeah,
and landing that are conventional takeoff and landing that have electric motors or hybrid power plants. Whatever is new and novel in that design, it's got to have the same consideration from a certification perspective.
yeah, yeah. I mean, you've done this with so many companies. What would you say are opportunities for the courageous and pitfalls for the
Yeah.
unwary?
Well, companies understand that there's a huge level of investment that has to be made. I would say one of the pitfalls we commonly see is the amount of marketing that's done. You see the booths at the trade shows that are sometimes the size of small houses. For,
Yeah,
for the money that's thrown at that and the
yeah,
trade show circuit, the amount of engineering that could go into the certification effort up front would maybe it wouldn't impress the investors as much, but it would certainly create a higher probability of success and a lower risk overall program. So
no,
I think,
I totally agree. I mean, I actually saw a company. I'm not going to mention which one. It was such a unique drone design, and I don't even describe it because then everybody's going to know what I'm talking about.
yeah,
But it was, let's just call it weird. I'd never seen anything like it, and and I was like, I saw people taking pictures of their rotors, and I'm like, man, they're so early in their thinking, and they have this booth and people are looking at their design and maybe stealing ideas. I didn't know where they were on the IP, and that's a whole nother issue, right,
yeah,
Charlton? Working with the
absolutely.
lawyers to protect your ideas, your
Yes.
intellectual property. But like everything you're talking about, that kind of certification path, what does that even look like? So hey, look, I'm all for the trade show floor and all the cool stuff on there. But you're right. Some people, they'll have this idea, and they're searching for like a problem to solve with it. Like they have a solution, but like, who did you actually make this thing for? Why are you making it? Can it fly? Will you get it certified? I mean, these are all things. So pitfalls, you gave us one. That's a big one. Let's do your top three pitfalls. I like
Okay,
top
so I
threes.
think marketing over engineering is
Yep.
that first one. The second one is probably unit economics. And you mentioned the function that it's intended to perform. A strong, really rigorous assessment of that market segment and what the opportunity is there, and then backing into unit economics that with my piece of kit, whatever that product is, when it goes and performs this function, after we account for all the costs of getting it into service, does it still work out, right? And I
Yeah.
think sometimes, and it's understandably, there's a lot of assumptions and speculation, in fact, that have to go into those calculations. But
Yeah.
I'm sure they're not too rosy. Aviation is a very harsh segment of the industry to enter into without a strong economic use case.
Well, I think a great example of that is kind of in that air taxi world,
Yeah,
where you're hearing things like, oh, this is going to cost, the same price as an Uber Black. It's like maybe 10 years from now,
right.
after like,
Yeah, you got to
but like
amortize the
on day
product.
one, maybe not so much.
Yeah, yeah. And
So
so I
yeah,
think the third best practice or pitfall to avoid is you can't run into this and claim that it's certification by obvious. And this happens very often with the technology side, coming out of Silicon Valley. Hey, my thing works, trust me. There's no certification or approval by obvious. You got to demonstrate that this thing works. And pushing back on that whole concept of demonstrating that it works to an adequate standard or an adequate level only creates friction. And the companies that push back the most take the longest to get through. And that is just time and money, man hours that you don't need to expend in a process that's already cumbersome.
yeah, wow. All right. Well, you kind of dipped a little bit into the kind of the pitfalls. why don't you let's do this. Let's talk about I want to break it out into maybe a couple different segments on certification planning and execution. Let's start up with that. And answer this one. How do you ensure that, let's stick with drones, a drone's design doesn't just meet the FAA standards, but actually surpasses them? Because, you know, you want to kind of, if you're putting all this money and time into the certification process, you don't want to get a C. I mean, you don't want to squeak by, like, and barely get that. Like, you
A
want to, like, sail through
minimum,
this thing,
right?
right? So
What are we?
what do you guys do at End State Solutions to help people ensure that they're gonna not just, get over the bar, they're gonna leap over that bar?
In almost every case, and this certainly applies to drones, but it applies across the board, almost regardless of size or complexity. Have a strong concept of operations. So the concept of operations forces the company to understand its own product and understand how that product's going to work in the environment it's intended to work in. So if you can flush all that out very clearly, if you can put that con-op through enough rigor that out the other side comes a clear understanding of the entire design and all the challenges that design will face in the operational environment, then that's going to push requirements. You'll know exactly where you need to be. Do I need to get a TC? Can we chase this through 44807? Do I need an experimental or what we call a SAC-EC, special airworthiness category experimental class? Do we need that in advance? Do we do that now? Where does that fall in the process? It pushes all those requirements. And if you do it in a rigorous way, then it clarifies your entire path. It's very strategic as well as tactical. So that's the starting point. And if that's done well, that will create a lot of clarity and de-risk the entire process.
I mean, it really dovetails into your comments about the economic viability, because if you don't really have a plan as to, like, how you're going to use this and in what manner you're going to operate it in what environment, kind of like, what are we doing here? But let's talk about the production certification. And I know there's unique challenges there that companies face when trying to establish, like, a process for that. It's one thing to design a vehicle, to know, theoretically how it's going to operate and then demonstrate that capability. There's another aspect of producing it, and frankly, Charlton, we're seeing this now with, country of origin bans and things like this. The pressure for U.S. companies and non, let's say, targeted countries to have a production process that kind of meets the FAA standard to have these, vehicles available.
Yeah, that's really invoked at the type certificate and production, full type certificate and full production certificate level. Really, what the production certificate is certifying a quality system that illustrates you understand along the way the entire production process and, in fact, maintenance process. So,
Hmm.
the facility itself, whatever, building that is, or has a flow within it, and there's things that occur along the way. The quality process that you overlay on top of that explains every step along that way and explains how we know it's being accomplished the way it's intended to. So that quality system is really what becomes the basis for the production certificate being approved.
And so your team the certification, like the type cert side, works with engineers, presumably. For the production certification, it's
Yeah.
your own expertise in what quality management systems that you're leveraging to help people through this production process.
Well, and it's through an FAA lens. So we've got a few folks who actually wrote production policy for the FAA and now do designated airworthiness representative work, as well as help companies create the processes that support the quality systems that they have to have for the production certificate. So we can do audits, we can do actually build up the documentation that supports that. And they go hand in hand, right? The level of complexity in the type certificate is in some ways reflected in the production certificate. But I will say the production certificate process and what you have to go do is in general a simpler or more clear-cut process than the type certification process, which may take into account a bunch of new and novel technologies. There are just generally fewer of those. Batteries might be an example in the production process, where you've really got to take into account new manufacturing processes or new ways of capturing the quality system for that particular part of the manufacturing process.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, and this will just kind of show my ignorance, so don't laugh at me. But I'm going to ask this: if you have a standalone manufacturing facility, do they also have to get certified? Like, does the FAA have to come in? So not just the process for a specific design.
Yeah, that PC, that production certificate covers the quality system and the facility. So the facility is actually certified under that PC.
Okay, wow. All right, cool, cool. So what if like someone's like white labeling drones for other people, but they have a facility? Do
Yeah.
do they get a standalone like production certification from the FAA?
So if it's a type certificate, the manufacturer is responsible for that design and for the production. In the 44807 process, the petitioner in the process, the company that's petitioning for the exemption can actually use other manufacturers' data to get the 44807 exemption. So
Oh,
not
okay.
uncommon. This isn't the case in all cases. And Silicon Valley in general wants to be very vertical, right? They want to own the product, they want to own the service.
Yeah, yeah.
Some of the companies, though, have approached it from more of an integrator perspective, where they take somebody else's product, use the data, use the product itself, and come to the FAA under the 44807 process and say, here's my drone. I am accepting responsibility as the manufacturer, and we're going to get this exemption issued to us with this equipment. So
Okay.
that's a nuance.
Roger that. Okay. So you guys, as you mentioned, also work on the operational certification side of it. And what would you say in that particular arena is the most often overlooked factor that can slow down a process? And when we say operation certification, we're talking, let's just say 135 drone delivery or 137 precision agriculture.
Right, right. So in general, folks want to invoke a couple of different operational use cases that enable that business case, right? So
Right.
it's beyond visual line of sight, and often it's many to one operations. And sometimes it's drone in the box that incorporates both of those as well.
Yeah.
But those levels of complexity are still the areas that aren't well defined in the rules. We're still waiting on Part 108. We're still waiting for some, I guess, equivalent level of safety to be defined by the FAA, and that hasn't happened yet. So if you're going to work BV loss, it becomes a challenge in that there's no script to go follow. You've got to down select the products that work for your detect and avoid solution, or you got to create the operational mitigations that support your mitigation for mid-air collision. And then
Yeah.
you've got to put that together in a package that the FAA can digest, understand, and approve. And that's why you only see a handful of companies that have really tackled this on scale at any scale,
Mm.
because it's unique still. It's not cookie cutter. It's not standardized.
Right. Well, it's almost unfortunate in a way that, like, let's give DIU as an example. They created the blue UAS list, but also the framework with components, like where they've basically blessed. Now I know this is security, cybersecurity, other standards that the DoD has that they're saying, hey, this company over here has this widget that we're saying is part of our framework. If you incorporate this widget, we're already good with that. I almost wish the FAA would do this so it's not like such a mystery to people. Look, you and I both know there's amazing companies out there that are tried and true, some that have been doing things for years, including in the crude space for airspace safety. Like, come on, let's just have a list and say pick and choose. Like, don't pick winners,
Right.
but like we know these work. So if you're using these, we're kind of good with those. Now
Yeah.
you have to combine them clearly,
Right.
like you said, a holistic package, but I don't know why there's not something like, I know that's non-standard, but like this is also a non-standard arena in a way. And it doesn't, I don't know, I don't see how it would, negatively impact safety, but that's just my opinion. All right, so let's talk about you do so many other things. You just kind of alluded to waiver and exemption enablement. Although the FAA doesn't have this magical list I just talked about, what's your impression of, kind of the folks you've been working with? Are they looking to approve these things? Because my perspective, just over the last 2 years, I've noticed this shift of kind of getting to know to really leaning forward, trying to get to yes.
Yes.
And what are you seeing in terms of that kind of regulatory and approval evolution in this space? When I say this space, like drones and even AAM.
Yes. So there has been a shift. It's been a positive shift. And we see the evidence of that shift, not only in the approvals you're talking about, but in some of the processes that are being refined behind the scenes.
That's a great point. Yeah.
So the FA is in a learning mode. I would say that AFS 700 is, as a shop, is leading the way there, and the leadership in that shop. I won't name names, but they're responsible in a good way for a cultural shift that is, let's get to yes safely still, but certainly starting with that principle that we're going to get to yes here shifts the conversation for industry and the FAA, and that's leadership, right?
Yeah. I mean, look, we're talking about, kind of performance-based, we're talking about risk-based approaches, where, yeah, there might not be a cookie cutter answer, but we're going to look at it carefully and we're going to try to work with people to get the yes. And honestly, I agree with you. Where I'm seeing huge evolutions in terms of process refinement is for public safety. I mean, I'm sure you're
Yep.
tracking this, Charlton.
Yep.
It's almost like every like other month, like something new is coming out. And I just saw the certificate of waiver, the cow, right? Instead of a COA, we're gonna do cows.
Yeah.
So God bless Charles Werner and drone responders. They're like, really pushing the envelope, working with the FAA closely and with all their thousands and thousands of members and drone responders and really getting some great things done for that community. So I love that. But you're working with individual companies on all of these things, and another aspect of what you're doing, Charlton, is the test plans for people. So whether it's that type certification or that operational certification, that FAA is inspecting things and they're also wanting to see some testing done. What do you
Yeah.
guys do in the testing arena to advise people?
Well, we help them distill the requirements, what's appropriate, what's not, what's within scope, if you will, to go and test. And that changes a little bit between 44807 and full type certificate based on the complexity of and the characteristics of the airframe. But we just help them distill what those requirements are and then help them put together the cards and the plan. So it's if you know what good looks like, it's not that complicated. It takes a little bit of time to cycle back and forth and come to conclusions and then document it, but that's really what it's all about, is creating a documented plan that the FAA will accept. And under the 44807, it's a declaration. We have done these tests. Take a look. Under the type certificate process, it's the FAA gets to participate in that. So it's much more closely monitored, more rigorous in terms of the FAA's involvement. But the result is the same in that the company has demonstrated to itself and either declared or shown the FAA that it works as advertised. It performs its intended function, and that's the
Yeah.
whole purpose of the test case.
So testing inherently involves flight operations. If we're talking about, things are going to be in the air. Tell us a little bit about the support you provide for that.
So we have provided folks to go on site and basically oversee testing and be the managers of the test program and liaise between the applicant and the FAA.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, you're just doing so much. I want to we're getting short on time, and I knew we would. And I apologize, Charlton, because I deviated from like the script we had agreed upon because there's so much to peel back here. So
Yes.
once again, everybody, if you're loving what you hear and you want to learn more, of course, reach out to Charlton anytime, but also see him at Law Tech Connect and Exponential because he's going to be moderating the AAM panel, and we're going to dive way deeper into that eVTOL piece of this. We're talking mostly about drones here. So I want to make sure that we talk about that and some of these successful launches that you've had, Charlton. So walk us through, a handful of these cases.
Okay. As far back as I guess the Scan Eagle days in 2012, we ended up flying commercially for ConocoPhillips up in the Arctic. It was a very safe place to go fly because there wasn't anything else going on. There was one other airplane that we interacted with. He said, "Hey, I'm here. We're there. No big deal, right?"
Yeah.
But that was historic. We ended up with that system going and flying for BNSF in New Mexico down in the lower 48. Again, a BV loss in a more complex environment. And then with the same system, because it had that pedigree, we were able to do some TFRs over fires and hurricane disaster recovery in Texas and up here in Oregon. And those TFRs at that point were the mitigation for mid-air collision. Otherwise, prior to that, there were no observers there. It was operational mitigations for mid-air collision. Then going on to the Matternet TC and PC, got that over the finish line. Took way longer than anticipated. And most recently, we got a 44807 and the 91113B waiver for a huge chunk of airspace in the San Joaquin Valley, with AATI as the OEM and Chevron as the operator, AATI operating for Chevron. So that's up to 8,000 feet MSL and covers about 4,500 square miles, with no reason to believe we can't do that in other places with similar products. So
Wow.
radar, the Echodyne radars were what AATI used on board the AI Ranger. So it's being done, and we see it being done in other places with different approaches, either operational or again using radars or optical systems. So we're nibbling at that point. And you mentioned that there's no solution that you can just slap down on the table and say, yes, this works, Mr. FAA. We're getting there, right? Because people are proving these optical or radar systems can be used to safely conduct the flights. Once there's a big enough market, and it all kind of has to come together, right? There has to be a big enough demand. There has to be enough reliability in the systems demonstrated. When that all comes together and overlaps, then you will start to see products that are more readily accepted by the FAA. So we're right on the cusp of that.
Oh, well, that's exciting. That's exciting. And we're not going to have time to really get into Elroy Air and some of the other things you're doing in the AAM space. So I'll just tease that and make sure, Charlton, you hold me to this, but let's make sure we're talking about that at Law Pack. So I want to make sure that we've got like one final slide. It's somewhat of a summary of all the things you're doing. So let's pop that up. How much, how long? We've kind of covered all of these topics, but I just wanted to leave the audience with a really good overview of all the things that End State Solutions is working on and bringing to the table. And as people kind of look at this, Charlton, and we get to really the end of our time together, I'd love to give you an opportunity to make some concluding remarks and also, tell people how they can reach you and what's next for you guys.
Sure, and apologies. I know the slide is effectively unreadable there on the screen. Feel free to reach out and we can share that. It's basically, look, everybody asks, how long is it going to take and how much is it going to cost me, right? So there are, and I generated the numbers on this slide using AI. I asked Claude basically, hey, how long does it take for these different processes and how much does it cost? And the answer came back pretty close. I think it may have been actually a little bit on the low side for some of this stuff. So understand that the cost can get very high and the timelines can get very extended if things don't go to plan. And that's why de-risking it early on is very important, understanding it early on. So yeah, there are, it's going to take investment almost no matter what, understanding the level of investment and how much of that you're going to need over time, and what the various milestones are where you can expect to have to invest more or seek additional investment's important, but make it a strategic approach, right? There are alternative paths to getting certified here in the US, and we've seen some of that in media recently. There are other constructs outside of the US where countries are very open to this technology and willing to grant access to the airspace in ways that are just different from the way the US might. So obviously, many of these companies that started out pursuing purely commercial work are also pursuing DoD work because the products have dual use and can be used the same way by the DoD as they are in the civil context. So that's another different revenue stream with different limitations and different opportunities. So we encourage that. Understand that whatever work you do in the DoD sector doesn't really tend to translate back into the civil sector. So to avoid rework, you really need to strategically plan that and do it in a way that's acceptable to both going in and avoid redoing it. So those are just a few of the considerations. We can certainly help mature plans, mature ConOps, and then get through the process. My email's listed, I think, on the beginning slide. C. Evans at End State Solutions. You can find me and the company both on LinkedIn. And we will be going tomorrow. In fact, we'll be at the eVTOL Insights down in Palo Alto. And then, of course, in May, we'll be at AUVSI Exponential with Don initially at LawTech Connect. So there you have it. I mean, we're here. We're plugging away. We've got some exciting stuff on the horizon. Much bigger stuff, in fact. So, yeah, can't complain.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Charlton, for this kind of around the world of everything you're doing and safety and standards and certification in particular, how you're helping companies succeed. And you've been doing it for years. I mean, for some people watching this, this might be like an aha moment, like, wait a minute, this is the company that was behind, the Matternet success. I mean, that was such a big deal for the industry. And you're kind of been flying a little bit under the radar. So I hope we're letting people know now, and I hope your phones ring off the wall. Everybody out there, thank you so much for joining us. We are at the end of our time. And once again, reach out to Charlton and hopefully see him in person at LawTech Connect in Exponential if you're not going to the eVTOL event this week. So, all right, everybody, that's it. That's all she wrote. Next week, we've got another great, amazing person. Rex Alexander from 5 Alpha. He's the vertiport guy. So can't wait to have him on the show too. Thanks again, Charlton. Everybody, we are out here.
Cheers.